All right, g'day, g'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis, the podcast where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name's Pietro. I'm joined today by someone who I'm a very big fan of and is a very central figure of kind of the journey for many people towards even hearing about libertarianism here in Australia. Certainly was one of the first to ever manage to breach Parliament with these ideas here and was quite outspoken and revolutionary at the time, I think. So I'm very excited to welcome to the show former Australian Senator for what was then the Liberal Democrats and is now known as the Libertarian Party, Mr. David Leyonhjelm. How are you, David?
I'm fine, thank you.
Very happy to have you on board. And um, it's funny because the first question I usually ask guests is, what you sort of assume that being a libertarian is not the status quo, right? The status quo is statism and government and rules, and people find their way to libertarianism through their own journeys. And most of the guests, I ask them the first question is, "How did you become a libertarian?" And many of them mention you, so you're part of many people's journey to hearing about libertarian ideas. So I'm curious to know, what was your journey towards becoming a libertarian?
Yes, I'm actually very pleased to hear that some people found the concept of libertarianism as a consequence of hearing me, because I set out to make that happen. When I was elected to the Senate, I had trouble, particularly with the media, but not only the media, with all sorts of people, trying to explain that I wasn't left wing and I wasn't right wing. I was a libertarian, and they couldn't get that. I used to be accused by some journalists of being confused because I supported some left-wing issues, such as drug law reform and same-sex marriage, which was an issue at the time. And I also supported some right-wing issues, such as low taxes and less regulation, removal of red tape, that sort of stuff. So they used to say to me that I was confused, and of course they were confused. They didn't know what they were talking about. So I took it on as a mission to change that, and I talked about libertarianism a lot. I wrote about it probably even more. We had a quiz on our website, on the LDP website, where you could go and answer a few questions and would tell you what your political quadrant was. And we used to put that on the bottom of our press releases and encourage the journalists to take that test themselves. And some of them were quite amazed to discover where they ended up. A few of them even admitted to me privately, not to be repeated elsewhere, that they were in the libertarian quadrant, which I thought was a huge joke, but then they'd never admit to it ever to anyone else ever again. So it was quite an interesting journey. And then I wrote my book, Freedom Salesman, which was basically just a collation of speeches and articles that I'd written over the first 3 or 4 years in Parliament. And that also has become, sort of a reference book for some people to understand what it means to be a libertarian. Mind you, there's no single view of what libertarianism means. There's a spectrum of opinion, but the broad parameters are well known. So my own journey to become a libertarian, I probably didn't know what the word was, but I always opposed government authority, which I thought was unreasonable. There were good reasons for governments to do things occasionally, but they ought to justify them, and they ought to be voluntary. And taking your money and then spending it on something that they thought was a great idea to get elected didn't ever struck me as a sensible, the right approach. So I joined the Labor Party at the age of 20 or thereabouts, or Young Labor probably, and the issues of the time were conscription. People my age were being conscripted into the army and sent to Vietnam, and some were being killed. And the other issue that motivated me was abortion. There were women being arrested, doctors being prosecuted in Victoria as I was living there at the time. And I thought that was totally unreasonable. I thought, it's women's business. It's the business of women, what they do with their body and whether they have children. And, I didn't think it was any role of the government to criminalise it. Whatever you thought the morals of it all were, you can approve or disapprove, according to those morals, but you shouldn't go invoking the authority of the state to enforce one view. So they were the two issues that prompted me, and that's fairly typical of a lot of libertarians who started off not thinking through the broad implications of their views, but were sort of motivated by one issue they felt strongly about, or perhaps two. Quite a lot of people joined the what's now the Libertarian Party as a consequence of one issue. Quite a few due to COVID, the COVID restrictions, as a matter of fact. And once they're in the party, they then consider whether or not, the other issues that the party represents are also their concerns. I wasn't libertarian by any means in those days. So conscription and abortion were the two issues that got me going. But I was a bit of an economic lefty. I didn't have any money. I was a student, and I thought other people's money was probably pretty attractive, like a lot of people do. And it wasn't until I was working and making healthy money and realising how much tax was going to the government and what they were spending it on that it sunk in that this wasn't necessarily something I approved of. And even then, I joined the Liberal Party after some years and discovered that really there was not a lot different, except they argued with the Labor Party about how to spend the money, not whether to spend the money. And they thought they were better at spending it than Labor Party, but rarely questioned whether to spend it. I found that very frustrating. Then I joined the Shooters Party in New South Wales, and they were great on the guns issue, of course. They're not as great anymore. They think the National Firearms Agreement is acceptable, and I don't. But they were terrific on the guns issue and fought well for shooters in New South Wales for some years. But when I tried to convince them that gun ownership and support for shooters was what ought to be our only issue, or at least it ought to be the basis on which we welcome people, I ran into barriers. So when I pointed out, well, there are some gays who are shooters, so we should embrace them, and at worst have a neutral policy on gays and same-sex marriage and things like that. But I said I really couldn't see why we should have any policies that make us lose gay shooters. Then there was soft drugs. I didn't push very hard on the Shooters Party on other types of drugs, but on marijuana, I said, we shouldn't be stressed about shooters who want to smoke marijuana. I got nowhere. They really didn't want to know. They were extremely socially conservative. So that then made me realise that I was a libertarian because I was in favour of liberty across the board. My default position was personal choice, and unless you were harming somebody else, it was none of the government's business. I then, at that point, I realised that was my philosophy. Live and let live. John Stuart Mill's basic principle of unless you're harming somebody else, it's nobody else's business. Those sort of things sort of sunk in, and it occurred to me that there was a word which described my political philosophy, which was libertarianism. So I joined the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats was almost dead at the time. Didn't have a bank account, didn't have a membership list, had a website. Everyone has websites, but was going nowhere. They'd run in a couple of Canberra elections, and that was it. So I got involved, and I ended up running the party for 8 years, leading up to my election. And but the reality is that hardly anybody else knew what a libertarian was. When I say hardly anybody else, not many people knew what a libertarian was until I got elected. And which brings me back to my first comments was about I had to set out to explain to the public in general what a libertarian was. And the reality is most of the public still have no idea. It's not a well-known word, but at least in the media and in the sort of the political elites, there is now an understanding of it. And that was what a major outcome of my 5 years in the Senate.
Yeah, and I mean, I've always sort of thought that the people not being aware of what the word libertarian is a great advantage to the state, because simply by knowing of the existence of this philosophy is enough to get people to open their minds. As for example, in your case, you didn't know that a libertarian was a thing until you encountered the fact that you were a libertarian. So the more it's obfuscated, the fact that nobody knows this word, nobody knows there's a political position where you can be for liberty across the board, the greater the advantage to the government, I think, in most cases. Um, the issue that I haven't really had anyone on to talk about guns and firearms and gun rights and stuff explicitly, and I know that's a very a focus of yours. So I would like to touch on that expertise a little bit. So broadly, so what is the lay of the land currently with the rights that firearm owners in Australia have? What is their position at the moment?
Well, from a freedom perspective, it's not very healthy, and it's getting worse. It began, well, there's been a steady encroachment on gun ownership for decades now. It took a serious backward step. The rights took a serious backward step in 1996 in the wake of the Port Arthur massacre, when John Howard attempted to virtually ban guns. He's recently elected. He'd only just been elected to government as Prime Minister. His personal view, as he stated, was, "I hate guns. I don't think anybody should have guns unless they are in the military, the police, or security." So that was his philosophy. So he went as far as he was able to make it impossible to own guns, apart from those exceptions. He didn't succeed in that entirely. He would have banned pistols entirely if he had a chance. A lot of long arms would have gone if he'd had his chance. So he encountered some pushback, but he made the end result of his efforts was the National Firearms Agreement, which made semi-automatic shotguns and rifles virtually unobtainable for ordinary people. There's minor exceptions, but virtually everyone is ruled out. There's magazine capacity limits, there's caliber limits, and in the time since 1996, 1997, when the legislation went through each of the states, there has been an increasingly restrictive rules imposed. It's been likened to slicing pieces off a salami. You don't notice it that much as each slice is taken off, but when you have the opportunity to look back and see what the salami used to look like, it's obviously a lot smaller. And that's where we're heading. So in New South Wales, for example, we have gel blasters. You can get arrested, thrown into jail for having them just because they look like real guns. Western Australia now is going through the process of limiting the number of guns you can have. No good reason, no evidence. That's in fact a story in most cases. There is no evidence that these additional constraints have any objective basis, but they bring them in nonetheless. The magazine capacities, it's based on some assumption that if you can't shoot as many bullets you will shoot less people. I mean, it's an utterly ridiculous idea, and it's obviously been introduced by people who don't know that you can swap magazines on guns. You know, it's crazy stuff. The caliber restrictions, or if the bigger the bullet, the more people you're going to kill with it, apparently. You know, it's irrational nonsense. The fuss they go through over the small number of people who can afford 50 caliber rifles and have somewhere to shoot them is just, you know, insane. There's just never ever been any misuse of 50 caliber. It's far too expensive to go misusing 50 caliber ammunition. But they're banned in most states, and if they're not already banned, then they'd like to do it. So, you know, my frustration all the way through has been, this is not about guns. This is about control. This is, and it's the history of weapons control. You know, the Romans used to disarm slaves and women and people out of favor, so they weren't allowed to have their, what they regarded as their military, their short stabbing swords, for example. So it goes way, way back. When it comes to firearms, there is just an endless series of examples of disarming people who are out of political favor. The famous ones, of course, are the Jews in Germany, but there's the Armenians in Turkey. There's people under Pol Pot's Cambodia. There's Rwanda. On and on and on and on it goes. Every single 20th century mass massacre was either accompanied by or preceded by gun control. So I see it as very sinister that Australia is essentially disarmed. It's, you know, the old saying is, if the government fears the people, there is liberty. If the people fear the government, there is tyranny. I can't see where that's wrong. And John Howard more or less spelt it out.
Something I think is interesting, because when trying to, whether you're campaigning or handing out flyers or talking to members of the public under an election, I find that a lot of Australians, when you start talking to them, the kind of average person, I would say, is pretty receptive to a lot of libertarian ideas. You know, these ideas, oh, you're right, actually, and there shouldn't be alcohol tax, or there shouldn't be this dumb law, or whatever, this, that, and the other. But with the example of guns, I find Australians are harder to reach on that. They've kind of had this ingrained into them for a long period of time, and it doesn't help that there's this sensationalization of the guns in the US, and the mass murders that also occur there are not helping the case for guns. So one thing that I thought was really interesting is that in 2020, 2021, when we had the lockdowns, which obviously we opposed vehemently, in the US, where there were states where people had, you know, more access to private firearms, you know, personal firearms and that sort of thing, the lockdowns were, if they were ignored by a significant enough portion of the public, they essentially didn't really exist, because the police didn't have the option to go into the streets and fire the rubber bullets on protesters, knowing that they were all disarmed, the way that they did here. And I thought that was an interesting moment where some people who here in Australia, who had previously not given any credence to the value of having guns, saw for the first time, oh, actually, wait, there are real consequences to having a completely disarmed population, and there are extents that the government can go to. So did you follow that? Did you think the same thing there?
I did. Yes, I had exactly the same thoughts watching the situation in America. When they would demonstrate against the lockdowns, they would carry their firearms with them openly. Many of the states now have open carry and permitless as well, so they don't need anybody's permission to carry their guns openly in public, unless it's a gun-free zone, and that's contentious. But yeah, there were lots of guns being carried by those who are demonstrating in the street against the COVID measures. That was a big difference, and you're absolutely right. That wouldn't have the police there would not have fired on them with rubber bullets and carried on like the Gestapo bastards that they did in Victoria in particular, and they were not a lot better in New South Wales, it must be said. So yes, having an armed population does make the government and the police behave themselves much more. So I totally agree with you. But if I can return to your original point about how hard it is to sell to the Australian public, that is an issue that I've encountered myself. So when I was in the Senate, I could talk about almost any subject and get nodding agreement from my audience, except when I talked about guns. And I was forever being told by supporters, not party members, but supporters, why don't you stop talking about guns? Or why don't you just drop that entirely? And I mean, I was quite aghast at that idea. And it was, I used to remind them, well, actually, I don't initiate the discussions about guns in most cases. I did over the Adler issue because that was a specific thing that I could do in an attempt to stop the gun laws getting worse. But most of the time when I talked about guns, it was in response to a question in the media or something else that prompted it. And so it wasn't really me. It was that there was a fascination on the part of some people to talk about it so that they could disagree with me. When I try to analyze what is it that you don't agree with me about, it was never really easy to put your finger on it. Mostly it came down to feelings. I don't like guns. Why don't you like guns? Because they kill people. Well, no, they don't. It's the people holding them that kill people. Oh, that's just splitting hairs, or some sort of answer like that. But then if I'd say to them, well, what do you think should be done about guns? Well, there's one or two people who would say to me, well, they should be banned. And when you say, well, how well has that worked with drugs? They go, oh, yes, well, okay, you've got a point there. And then they say, but they should be very restricted. Okay, so what kind of restrictions? And then it would become obvious they had no idea what the current restrictions were. And they would suggest restrictions that were either already in place or would, totally absurd. They had no real idea. But I also discovered that even shooters really didn't understand the politics of it or even the issues, the control type issues. They would say to me, oh, it's not that bad. I can comply with it all right, and I just ignore it all and all that sort of stuff. That frustrated me a bit. And all of that, in fact, was why I wrote the book, the gun control book, because I wanted to at least put the people who are prepared to think about the issue in rational terms. I wanted to give them some fact base on which they could consider it. But the truth is, vast numbers of people aren't interested in facts or objectivity about the gun issue. They're emotional. This is I've been trying to get my head around why that should be so. And my feeling is it's primarily a 21st century phenomenon that we have feelings involved in public policy. I don't know that the old saying used to be, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, that's not the case anymore. You can claim to be offended if somebody misgenders you, discriminates against you for all sorts of reasons. And no harm is done to you except your feelings. And we've got legislation that reflects that. So it's not entirely inconsistent that we should have legislation that reflects the irrational emotions about guns. I'm not saying any of it is good. In fact, I despise all that nonsense. But once you start legislating about being offended, it's not a major step to say, well, I don't want to feel afraid. It doesn't matter whether that fear is rationally based or not, but I don't want to feel afraid. And what will make me feel less afraid? Oh, knowing, nobody's got any guns. So that's where I think that's where we're up to with the debate, and we are losing. We're going backwards. And legislation on feelings is getting worse. And restrictions on gun control based on nothing other than feelings and the appearance of the gel blasters, which I gave the example I gave a minute ago. That's another example of feelings. They can't do any harm with a gel blaster. It just looks like a real gun. They make me nervous. I'm afraid of them. I don't want to be scared. All sorts of reasons justify banning them. We then also have, as you alluded to, the media, and not just the news media, but also movies and perceptions of guns from people who have almost no exposure to guns in their life, form impressions based on what they see, on the TV or in the movies. And to many of them, there are only two countries in the world that are relevant. There's America and there's Australia. Australia has tough gun control. America doesn't have tough gun control. America has some mass shootings, not as many as they will tell you, but some. Therefore, Australia's tough gun laws prevent mass shootings. It's as simplistic as that. It's pretty stupid and simple-minded, if you ask me. But, there are plenty of stupid, simple-minded people around who will sign up to that sort of argument.
Well, and that's kind of the main argument that you are contending with across the board, right? It's the US is so sensationalized, both because they are, this cultural hub for everyone, and everyone's got their eyes on them, and because they have these, quote unquote controversial, as opposed to different to us, gun laws. But so how do you respond? Let me play devil's advocate for a second. How do you respond to that question because that is by and large the main question that comes up, right? Is the US has relaxed gun laws and they have mass shootings. If we relaxed our gun laws here, we would also have similar mass shootings. What's incorrect about that?
Yeah, so the answer from my point of view is to bring in other countries. Don't limit it to an Australia versus America contest. So you can mention the situation of Switzerland. Switzerland has conscription. When people finish their military, or even while they're in the military in reserves, they have their firearms at home, ammunition. They are entitled to use their firearms and go to shooting ranges and shoot them. In fact, they're encouraged to do that. They are encouraged to participate in the shooting sports, full stop. Just about every village in Switzerland has got a shooting range. Australia might have a swimming pool. In Switzerland, they'll have a shooting range. Every town, they're all over the place. They have baffles. They're beautifully designed. They have baffles and things like that to make sure the bullets stay within the scope of the range. So Switzerland's a good example, and Switzerland's is as safe or safer than Australia. So in other words, just because Australia has tough gun laws does not mean we have less murders, less violence. Switzerland has relatively relaxed gun laws, and they have similar or lower violence rates to Australia. Another example is the Czech Republic. They have, a bit like America, they have a right to carry concealed for self-defense, and guns are quite widely owned. It's a safe country, so not that many bother to carry a gun, but they can. It's as safe as Australia. When you're talking murder rates one to the other, the differences are insignificant. So if it's gun laws that create a safe society, how do we reconcile that with the examples of Switzerland and the Czech Republic? My argument is that they are in what are called independent variables. That you could change the gun laws in America and it wouldn't make any difference to violence rates. You could relax the gun laws in Australia, it wouldn't make any difference to violence rates because they operate independently. They are gun ownership is not driven by violence, and violence is not driven by gun ownership. They are unrelated. The factors that are responsible for violence, and guns are only one element of violence, are quite a lot different. They're really unrelated to the availability of the means to commit violence. Guns are just a means to commit violence the same way as knives and hammers and baseball bats are. And, the proposition that if you ban knives, hammers, and baseball bats, you'll have less violence would be laughable. And yet that is exactly the argument that's used against guns. So you have to bring in other countries. But of course, a lot of people are not interested in staying for that kind of discussion. I've tried many times to ask people, well, what do they know about Czech Republic or Switzerland? And of course, they know nothing. All they know about is America. And how do they know about America? Oh, they saw it on the movies or the news. And it's a pretty superficial discussion.
Well, there's also the important distinction that even within America, different states have varying degrees of gun control laws, and the ones which are maybe have had the most gun violence and have put in the most restrictive laws are still the ones with the highest number of shootings. So it's kind of like, well, it's no longer the law abiding who have access to the guns, but what do you know? The people who are shooting other people in a violent manner aren't law abiding anyway. They don't care about a rule that says you can't own a gun. So there's also that parallel there.
Yeah, that's quite right. There's actually reasonable data on that in the American context, that the more widely owned self-defense guns are, the lower the violent crime rate. And the reason is, so it's a complex argument, but John Lott's a strong proponent of it. He's done some very good work on it with good statistics. His view is, if the criminals know, the people with criminal intent know that their potential victims can shoot back, then they won't commit the crime in the first place. And that seems to be the case. That seems to be what the evidence shows. So those states, there's now 40 odd states, I think, where concealed carry is relatively easy. People without a criminal background can carry guns in those states without too much trouble. It gets complicated because now they're getting to the point where they're openly carrying guns in many states, and I often wonder whether that's actually better for crime control. It's asserting a constitutional right, and I've got no argument with that. But one of the best things about concealed carry is the Crims never knew who might be armed. That makes an awful lot of sense. Whereas if they see that somebody's packing a gun, if they've got evil intent, then they might go for that person with the gun and disarm them in the first place. So, that's a different argument, though.
Yeah, and also there's when you talk about the gun-free zones, it makes a lot of sense that point that the areas where there are people disarmed are the ones that are most targeted. Like this crazy sick fad of shooting up schools. Schools are the most notorious gun-free zones.
Yep.
And there was also that example of I think it was the Uvalde police who wouldn't go in to stop the shooter. So the population is disarmed, and the tax paid for members who are supposed to be the armed representatives of the population are refusing to go in to defend the unarmed is absurd in and of itself.
Yeah, so that was a failure of the police to do their job. That was really criminal. But the gun-free zone issue is an issue. It is a real issue, because if you're going to have a nutcase with evil intent, and they know that people are going to shoot back at them, or they might shoot back at them, they have second thoughts about it. If they know that there won't be anybody in there who can shoot back at them, then that's one factor they don't take into account. This is an American issue, of course, because gun massacres are more common over there. It's something in the air or the water or some damn thing that prompts more people. Not as many as people make out. It's a very big country. It's 350 million people. So, you take into account that. You've got to keep things in perspective. But there is no question that there is a level of mass shootings which you don't see really in other countries, not even other countries with lots of guns, which are a bit cowboyish. Brazil being a good example. Lots of guns in Brazil, most of them are illegal, but you still don't see much in the way of mass shootings. You'll get an occasional one, but then you've got Australia's had several, even since the Port Arthur, the John Howard gun laws, we've had 2 or 3 mass shootings. So what we mean by mass shootings is 5 or more victims. We've had them since the John Howard gun laws came in. So, this perception that the Howard gun laws stopped Port Arthur type events, where we never had anything as big as Port Arthur before Port Arthur. We haven't had anything as big as that since, but we certainly have had mass shootings.
Yeah, and it begs the question, obviously, if we'd had restrictive gun laws prior, would Port Arthur still have occurred? And there's nothing to say that it wouldn't have happened anyway.
Correct.
Often something that pro gun rights advocates criticize the legislators and people who are very anti-gun about is the fact that they don't know anything about guns themselves. These are people who are completely unfamiliar with how they work, how they operate, things about them. You mentioned the magazines and stuff like that. So what are do you think some of the biggest misconceptions that the public or that these legislators have about guns that are pervasive in their decision making?
Yeah, that was actually a major motivation for writing my book, gun control book, the sheer ignorance of people. And they didn't know which end of the barrel the bullet comes out of, almost. So the issues, they don't know the difference between centerfire and rimfire. They don't know the difference between shotguns and rifles. They don't know much about pistols, although they tend to have seen them on movies. They don't know their range. They don't know about magazines and how many will fit in a magazine. It is, an ignorance zone. There's no question about it. And I set out to address exactly those questions in my book. So I've got descriptions of the actions: centerfire, rimfire, shotguns, pistols, automatic, semi-automatic, what a machine gun is, and the calibers. I've got pictures of bullets in it, that sort of stuff. So, but the big issues, as I said, are mainly around feelings, and the feeling has arisen that there's something about semi-automatics that makes them more deadly. I address that in my book, but it doesn't seem to have had any impact on anybody. Just because you can fire a semi-automatic rapidly does not mean you're going to hit more people. In fact, the more rapidly you fire, the less accurate you will be. The AK-47 rifle, for example, was used by terrorists and left-wing insurgents and so forth all over the world. It will fire on full auto. And I used to work in what was called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, as a vet many years ago. And many times I was told, when you get ambushed, if you don't get hit within the first 2 or 3 bullets that get fired, you won't get hit because they fire their AKs on full auto. The effective shooting makes them lift, so they lifts the barrel up and they'll go over your head. And accuracy any rifle fired on full auto is very low. You have to be very, very good shooter with a lot of practice to shoot accurately and fast. And that's absolutely true of full autos, but it is also true of semi-auto. So back in the days when we were allowed to shoot semi-autos, I used to shoot at a range in Sydney in a military rifle club, and some of the courses of fire involve shooting quite quickly with a semi-automatic, and your first 2 shots would hit the target, and after that they'd go anywhere. So nobody understands that. But there's this perception that semi-automatics are more dangerous, that larger magazines make a rifle more dangerous. There's also the perception, which President Biden perpetually goes on about, that having black plastic furniture on a gun makes it an assault rifle. You can have exactly the same rifle, exactly the same caliber, exactly the same action. You put on a nice walnut stock, which doesn't have a pistol grip, and people will go, oh, that's not a bad rifle. Yeah, that looks fine. Put a black plastic stock on it, perhaps with a raised sight system, and a pistol grip, a black pistol grip, all plastic, and suddenly it's an assault rifle. And this is another area in which rational sense, objectivity just departs the scene. There's just no basis for that. But every time there's a shooting in America, Biden's out there going on and on and on about how we're going to ban assault rifles. The fact is, it's not an assault rifle. Assault rifle is a military weapon. The military have not used semi-automatics since the Second World War with their Garands. Their rifles have been full auto for a long time. That's arguably an assault rifle, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the AR-15 style rifle with the black plastic furniture on it, and it just labels them assault rifles. It's ridiculous, but it betrays the ignorance that we're dealing with in this debate. We're not talking about objective facts and data. We're talking about feelings.
Well, and on there is there is certainly an appetite for this feeling, like these feelings of wanting to be safe and wanting to know that the population is disarmed in order to feel safe yourself. There is an appetite for that. I'd say also in the US probably, but also certainly here. When it comes to the people in charge, your Bidens, your Labor Party, Liberal Party, whoever it may be, who are taking these steps at every opportunity they have to slice away at the salami and reduce the rights that gun owners have. To look at it like looking at it from a libertarian lens, do you think they are responding simply to the feelings in order to gain votes, to gain popularity, or do you think it's something more sinister in terms of genuinely, as a strategy to disarm the population and increase control, disarm people?
So I think you have to distinguish between the politicians and the policymakers. The politicians rarely take a position on guns unless on the basis that it'll win them votes. The Greens do a bit, which is funny because back in the day, Karl Marx was quite a proponent of gun ownership because it allowed you to fight against the capitalist state, the bosses, which I find remarkable because the Greens are essentially Marxist in pretty much all the areas, and yet they are the chief proponents of gun control and disarmament. And of course, they haven't thought through the fact that they would be disarming while the capitalist state, which they'd like to overthrow, is armed to the teeth. But anyway, just remind me what your point was again. head off on. I tend to
Well, do you
choose
think
my own
it's
points.
do you think they're responding to feelings to
Oh
try
yeah,
and win votes, or is it something more sinister?
yeah. So mostly no, they're not looking for votes. The Greens are an exception, but mostly they're not. Most of them are actually woefully ignorant about guns. And so their feelings will be, oh no, we can't have them, but they don't say or do anything about them. The impetus for policy changes and for making things worse for shooters um, might come occasionally from a politician, as it did with John Howard, but mostly it comes from the bureaucrats, the people who um, think they know best. We saw them during COVID. There's quite a lot of them. Um, you know, they're smarter than us. They're more informed than us. What to the extent that we have information, it's misinformation or disinformation. Um, and uh, and they just think, well, I'm just gradually nudging society in the direction that I think it should go in, and that includes um, more or less civilian disarmament. They know now that with some political parties defending shooting and defending gun ownership, they know that that can't be done as in a single step. But like the Fabians, they believe in gradualism. So they're, every now and again, there will be an opportunity for them to propose a measure that is just another slice off the salami. They will put it up to one of the committees, one of the policy committees, and there's nobody at those committees to disagree with them. So they choose who's on those committees. They're mostly state representatives because gun control is constitutionally a state issue, but they now all coordinate via the National Firearms Agreement committees. So there's a couple of levels of that. And there's nobody on any of those committees who is a gun rights advocate. There is nobody like me or you or Shooters Union or SSAA or anybody like that represented in those groups. They're just public servants, and they don't even have much expertise. I've been to occasional consultative meetings with those people, and they're barely better informed than average person in the street. Even the cops that they assign to the firearms registry in New South Wales, who I've encountered from time to time, even they're no enthusiast for shooting sports. Most of them don't shoot themselves, and they have very limited knowledge of shooting. If you said to them, well, what makes you think a 50 caliber rifle is dangerous, for example, wouldn't have an answer. Just sounds bad. So I don't think the politicians are the prime culprits. I think it's bureaucrats, and not a lot of bureaucrats either. Most of those who make a difference, if you counted up the ones who made a difference, you wouldn't add up to more than 20 or 30 in Australia.
And these are all, I take it, bureaucrats who are unelected, impossible to remove in these positions where, there's nothing we can do. We won't even know who they are specifically.
Certainly, we don't know. Well, you know who they are in some cases. You can find out who the lead bureaucrats are in Victoria and New South Wales. I think the local shooting organisations know who they are. But you're right, there's absolutely nothing you can do about them unless you can find, get something on them that they've done misusing their position. You can, of course, argue if you find out if they make a public statement or have a recommendation to their organisation, to their minister or whatever. You can, of course, try to counter that. But you often find out late in the day what that is. So a policy proposal will do the rounds of a department. There might be other departments whose opinions get brought in, and so the policy is well advanced, and then finally you'll hear about it one way or another, and you have an opportunity to do something about it. By then, it's got momentum, and you're not going to head it off. And my view is that ultimately the only counter to that process is at the parliamentary level. You have to have people like me, enough people like me in a position that we can say, this is nonsense, I'm not going to support this. And if you don't back off, you're not going to have my support for passing your bills or doing something. And so you can put a stop to it. And I unfortunately only had one vote in the Senate. If there'd been 6 of us, it would have made a massive difference, absolutely massive difference. But there were times when I was able to use my influence or my vote or blackmail or whatever to make a difference. But very little of it at the legal level, at the law level. I managed to save the Malabar Rifle Range in Sydney, for example, and got it a long-term lease, and it's absolutely secure. And that followed about 10 years of the Commonwealth trying to throw their shooters off the range. I managed to fix that, and it would not have happened but for me. But you don't get many opportunities like that.
And so I suppose this that leads well into another question that I wanted to ask, which is, I mean, this is all a pretty pessimistic view of the direction things are going, right? Like it doesn't seem like there is very much that can be done to stop it. And even in the cases where we had someone like you in Parliament, the best that you're doing is kind of putting a stop to certain things. It's virtually impossible to push back in the other direction and regain some of the rights that are already lost. So is there, do you think, a possible path towards actually pushing back in any meaningful sense? Like, for example, maybe if we had 6 senators, something like that, would that actually be able to make that sort of difference?
Yeah, so I'm not totally pessimistic. I think there are things that can be done. Good advocacy is always a good idea, and we don't have much of that. The shooting organisations are not very good advocates overall, and they really do need to improve. And at the political level, we have seen in Victoria the Combined Firearms Council work very productively with shooting groups to influence all of the parties, all the major parties in that state. And as a consequence of that, deer hunting and duck and quail hunting are now pretty much accepted as legitimate activities in Victoria. Whereas in New South Wales, for example, duck hunting is banned. It still occurs, but only under permits on rice. But as a general thing, it's banned. Deer in New South Wales are categorised as pests rather than game animals now. So basically, you're allowed to poison them and do all sorts of things as well as shoot them, and that's not desirable from a hunting culture point of view. So the political activity in Victoria has had some positive benefits. You don't get many examples like that though, and overall the momentum is backwards. But what that does show is that something can be done if shooters get together and they use their votes, they use their voice, they can make change. The issue is most of them are not politically savvy, so they don't know how to make change. And they also have excessive expectations. So they will say, unless we can throw out the National Firearms Agreement, it's not worth it. And of course, they're never going to throw out the National Firearms Agreement, at least in one go. It'll take a decade, 2 decades to get rid of that. So they are not satisfied with incremental improvements. And as a consequence, they say, oh, it's all worthless. I don't see any point doing anything. I don't know what the answer to that is, other than that those of us who think we can make a difference, and then point out, okay, if we made a difference and we didn't have your support, imagine how much more we would achieve if we had your support. I can't think of any other way to do it, but I don't pretend that I have all the answers. I don't think I have. Getting people elected, that's obviously one way to do it, but that's difficult. You're dealing with essentially a two-party system, and we know that minor parties don't get much of a look in. The system is designed to discourage them, and we know that the shooters' vote is probably only worth 2%. There's lots of shooters who don't vote according to their shooting interests. So, attracting political support or getting political support is challenging. So if you put all your eggs in that basket, you probably won't win. But what you can do is what they did in Victoria with the Combined Firearms Council, is direct shooters' votes to politicians from the mainstream parties who are positive and away from those who are not positive. Use preferences with the minor parties to favour those that are more positive than others, and that can have quite an effect. And even if analysis later proves it didn't have much of an effect, you can still scare the crap out of the candidates who believe their political future depends on this issue, and that will shake them out of their comfort zone, and they may then adopt a more reasonable or objective position. And with that in mind, I actually posted my book, copies of my book, the paperback version, to every politician in Australia in 2022, 2021, 2022, I think it was, every single one, thinking that at least some of them might be interested in having some objective facts to work with. That included the Western Australian politicians, and yet here we are in Western Australia with proposals to impose even more restrictions on firearm ownership, calibers, magazines, and of course the number of guns you can own. None of it based on even a scrap of objective evidence. And so, at times like that, I feel like a total failure. You can try and try and try, and then you see a result like that, and you think, well, what did I achieve? So I'm not suggesting that it's easy, but the alternative is to give up, and I'm very reluctant to give up.
Well, and I mean that's kind of the libertarian view of everything. Everything's moving in the wrong direction, and we refuse to give up because that's unacceptable. And I mean, I certainly feel that way as well.
Yeah.
The book, for any of our viewers who are interested, is called Gun Control, and I'll put a link in the description where anyone can purchase it. We are almost at the hour mark at the end. But I did want to ask you something that you alluded to before, a little bit aside from the gun control issue. You mentioned, some of the ways when you were a senator to get things done was, deals and blackmail and these sort of dark arts behind the scenes, politician-y things that we as libertarians assume occurs in Parliament. We see it all as, this dark beast that acts on its own and in its own self-interest. Is it as I wanted to know, just in your experience, is it as disgusting and dirty working in that environment as we imagine it? What's it like being in that environment for such an extended period of time as well as you were?
It's dirty and disgusting within the parties. There's a famous saying originated from the Labor Party, but it's not. You could also apply it to the Liberals and the Nationals. There was a new member of Parliament sitting beside an old member of Parliament, long-term member of Parliament, side by side in the chamber, looking across, and the young one said, "Those people are our enemies," and the old member said, "No, son, Those people are your opponents. Your enemies are sitting behind you. And that is actually true. It's within the parties, it is dirty, really dirty pool. At the parliamentary level, it's entirely a numbers game. So if the government's got the numbers, they use them. If they don't have the numbers, they negotiate. They try to get the numbers. And there are quite a lot of legislation goes through with no opposition from anybody. Or then there's others where, when I was in there, the coalition was in power and Labor was in the opposition. And Labor would say, yeah, we're not going to fight over this. So you put the coalition votes and Labor votes together, that's a majority. It didn't matter what I thought. So there were many times when I would oppose bills and vote against them. I'd call a division, or someone else would call a division and vote against them, but it made no difference. So what you had to look for was times when the government was proposing something which you disagreed with, and Labor and the Greens and so forth were opposed to it, and where the government would need my vote to get it through. And I spent, a lot of my time and effort trying to look for issues like that. What I had to also be careful of, though, was that if I was in favour of the bill and the Liberals needed my support, I couldn't very well go to them and threaten not to vote for it, because, Groucho Marx said when in that movie, he said, I have principles, and if you don't like those, I have others. I don't have others. I just have one set of principles, and so I had to stick to them. So what that all added up to was that there were limited number of opportunities where the government needed my vote, and I was happy to negotiate around my vote. I was indifferent to the legislation, so it could be passed or not passed, or I was opposed to it. I would also try to talk to the other crossbenchers to see if there was any chance that we could make a difference as a group. I was on very good terms with Pauline, Malcolm Roberts, Brian Burston, those people. When Corey Bernardi was in there, he was in the Liberals, although he left the Liberals while I was there. So we would work together from time to time and see if we could negotiate something better. Sometimes the price of our support was an amendment, and there were a few examples where I got legislation amended as the price of my support. There were times when I would talk to Labor, and Labor would say, well, what can you agree to? I never asked for money to be contributed to any of the things that I felt needed. I didn't want money for my local sporting clubs or anything. I never once wanted money. Even the Malabar Rifle Range, I ruled out getting money paid to the rifle clubs. All I wanted was a lease, a long-term secure lease for them. Now, that wasn't the same with some of the other crossbenchers. Some of the other crossbenchers had their favourite local things. Jackie Lambie's pretty notorious for screwing money out of the government for her Tasmanian projects. And that's where a bit of dirtiness goes on. You don't get any personal benefit out of it other than potentially making yourself a hero in your local area. But if you can swing, a few million dollars from the government into an area where you've got a profile and you're looking for votes, then that might boost your chances. I never did that. New South Wales is a big state, and where do you start anyway? And plus it was against my principles to be taking taxpayers' money and spending it on my fripperies. So, but there is a bit of funny business goes on over that. And of course, the examples of that's not limited by any means to crossbenchers. In fact, probably crossbenchers are less prone to that sort of thing than government members. So we saw the example of the grants going to marginal electorates, or the Nationals handing out money to their mates for projects. Now, nobody personally benefited from, well, no politicians personally benefited from that. It was the rewards were all in the hope that they might get more votes. But in the end, taxpayers' money is being used for things that really aren't all that beneficial.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the, I guess a lot of that is the dirty and disgusting that we all see as well. Look, I think that's a good place to finish up. Thank you very much for your time, David. Is there any last message, anything that you might have missed that you wanted to mention before we head off?
No, they've covered it well. Thank you.
Perfect. If you don't follow us already, you can on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and Twitter. Again, thank you for your time, David, and thank you very much to all our viewers for listening. We will catch you next time.